Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. It's been a few weeks since I've filmed. My husband and I have been super busy. We had a wedding to go to and we had my in-laws in town visiting and just lots going on. I'm currently 32 weeks pregnant, so getting a little big and uncomfortable. So I'm finally back. In this video, I really wanted to spend some time on because it's gonna be a long one. And so actually I'm at my parents' house right now filming and I have a friend watching Bodhi so I could really focus and not just fit this into one of his nap times because this is just gonna be too long and involved for that. So welcome back. Today I'm going to be doing a video on my labor and delivery story or Bodhi's birth story. And also just talk about how I overcame my debilitating fear of childbirth. I've always been someone who's been extremely medically squeamish. When I was a kid, I couldn't even imagine being pregnant myself because I've always been terrified of surgery. Yeah, like anything medical, I hate hospitals, like anything like that freaks me out. So the thought of giving birth always terrified me. So my son's due date was October 26, 2022. And when October hit, I was terrified. And I had to keep myself super distracted because if I wasn't busy doing something else, I was freaking out about labor. And I think the scariest part for me was just the unknown. And my mom had me 2 weeks early. And so I was just like, I felt like at any moment I could go into labor early. And I think that was just like really scary for me. Just not knowing what it was going to feel like, how much pain I'd be in. Like I was terrified of having a C-section, like surgery while being awake is probably my worst nightmare. I was afraid of tearing. I was afraid of all of it. I just had no idea what to expect, obviously. And so anyway, was super scared. And I have actually my laptop here. I typed out a bunch of notes about the whole process because I really want to touch on everything. And I didn't want to forget anything or leave anything out. So I go into my doctor at 39 weeks and I am huge. And I was being stopped by people when I was out asking if I was having twins or even triplets once because I was like huge. I'm not very tall. And I had a big, like almost, 9-pound baby. And I carried it all out in front and I was massive. And my blood pressure was like fluctuating, getting a little high. And I was just like unbearably uncomfortable as, a lot of moms are in the last few weeks of their pregnancy. So my doctor offered to induce me at 39 weeks and I turned it down and freaked out, which in the now I know, this time around, if she offers that, I am on board. I ended up having to be induced at 40 weeks because the baby wasn't coming. And I know, there's a lot of moms out there who are much bigger fans of going into labor naturally and would have probably not chosen induction at 40 weeks. But I was so scared that I just wanted to get it over with. Just sitting and waiting, as I approached my due date. And then as I hit my due date, I just needed things to get going. So I was induced at 40 weeks and I had a very positive induction experience. When my doctor offered to induce me at 39 weeks, all I had heard was that induction was more painful and way more intense and I was terrified and that it would take a lot longer, all the things you don't want to hear about your labor. I'd heard about being induced. So I was no, I really want to try to go into labor naturally. So that last 2 weeks, 38 and 39 weeks, I was doing every single thing I could possibly think of and everything I had read about to go into labor on my own. I was curb walking outside of our house, which people in our neighborhood were probably what is this woman doing? I was drinking red raspberry leaf tea. I was eating dates. I was doing these YouTube videos of yoga poses that they swear put you into labor. Nothing was working. So 40 weeks hits and my doctor was like, okay, like on your due date, October 26th of 2022, like let's induce you. So I finally gave up and was like, okay, I'll do induction. Like I just got to get this over with, get the show on the road. My labor induction was 34 hours from start to finish. So like when they first gave me my labor reducing medications until Bodhi was out. And that seems like a very long time. So yes, the labor process of induction for me was quite a bit longer, I think, than the average first time labor for a first time mom. However, I hope to be induced again. I hope to be induced for this baby that I'm currently due on May 12th with. I'm hoping that if we decide to have future kids that I'll be able to be induced then, because for someone as anxious as me, and I know that like all, pregnant moms in the last weeks of their pregnancy can relate to this. Like it is just very stressful not knowing when it's going to start. Like just you're sitting there like waiting for the fire drill to happen, right? So for someone who was so fearful, it was really nice to drive calmly to the hospital, right? Check in, get on my hospital gown, not be in any pain and panic. And this time with my son, like having him all set up and at my parents' house, or right, actually here where I am right now, like having him set up here, and everything ready to go for him for, my husband and I are in the hospital, will be such a peace of mind for me. So, my induction experience was a really positive one. So I hope to share that so that moms who are getting induced are not as scared of it as I was, because there's lots of horror stories out there on the internet. So on October 26th of 2022, I was 40 weeks, it was my due date, my husband and I checked in to the hospital, and they started off, I got changed in my hospital gown and got settled, and then they started off by giving me Cytotec, which was these like pills that were dissolvable. And they gave me, I think, a total of 3 or 4 doses every 2 hours because I was 0% dilated at all. I was not my labor hadn't started whatsoever. So they needed to get my cervix jump started into labor. So they gave me Cytotec that night, and they came in, every 2 hours to give me another dose. And at this time, I was in like no pain at all. One tip that I have actually that I wanted to share with you guys, I had heard that a lot of women get very nauseous and even throw up during labor. I think it's just like your body's natural response to laboring. And I was like, I can't imagine pushing or like going through the, really painful contractions while also feeling extremely nauseated. So I had on my birth plan, and I told the nurses when I got in that throughout the duration of my labor, I wanted them to give me Zofran. Zofran is a pregnancy safe anti-nausea medication. I take it on and off during my pregnancies. It really works for me. And in the hospital, they just administer it through an IV. So I was on Zofran for the entire time that I was in the hospital. I had no nausea, no vomiting, none of that. So there's a lot that you're going through during labor. The last thing you want is to be throwing up on top of it, which I guess is very common. So that was really helpful for me, and I plan to do it this time too. I'd been on Cytotec all night, every 2 hours getting doses. And the next morning, Thursday, October 27th, so like 12 hours later, I was hoping to be much further along than I was. They measured me, because I was on Cytotec all night. They measured me and I was only dilated to a 3. So I wasn't in active labor yet. I wasn't to a 4. And I was hoping just that things would go quicker, because I was, really scared and just would rather have gotten it over with faster. But it's funny, because when we checked in, they had told me and my husband that labor induction would take a very long time, could take a very long time. So they were like, we predict that you'll be delivering like Saturday or Sunday. And I was like, are you serious? It's Wednesday. Like, how is that a thing? So we were like, no, it'll be much faster than that. and they were probably just telling us that, for the worst case scenario. So that morning when I was a 3 and, had been there for 12 hours, I was like, wow, this is going to take a long time. And we were like, okay, we may be here till Saturday or Sunday. So, yeah, I was like I said, I was a 3 that morning. And at that point, I was only having very, very, very mild cramping. So I've had period cramps way worse than that. So wasn't in active labor yet, wasn't having very painful contractions. So I was just hanging out, mostly bored. And they stopped the cytotech though, because although I was only at a 3, I was having very regular contractions on my own at that point. My labor had been jump started. So they were like, we don't need to give you any medication. And then that morning or early afternoon, my OBGYN came into the hospital and told me that, she would come back later that evening, and that if I had progressed, to a 4 or 5 or whatever, that my water hadn't broken on its own, that she would break my water. So I was excited for that, very nervous and scared also, but just excited that I had heard that having your water broken, speeds things up a lot. So it's the afternoon on that Thursday and we're just hanging out there. Luckily, I hadn't been in a ton of pain at that point. And the nurse asked me if I want an epidural. And I definitely had wanted an epidural. I had planned on getting it, but I had heard all these things on the internet that from other moms that you have to wait until you're 4 or 5 or 6 centimeters because epidurals can slow down your labor and they can wear off. So you don't want to get it too early. So I told the nurse, I was like, yeah, I really want an epidural, but shouldn't I wait until I'm a little bit further along? Because I was only 3 centimeters still. And she was like, well, we have 4 scheduled C-sections, starting in 30 minutes. So you're either going to get it now or you're going to have to wait until after the anesthesiologist is done with all of these 4 C-sections to get one. And I was like, yeah. So I would rather get it now, even though I'm 3 centimeters and not in very much pain at all, than wait who knows how long and possibly be in excruciating pain by the time that they could come back and give it to me. So I opted to get the epidural very early. And actually, this is something that I plan to do again. I know everyone's labor and delivery stories are so different and epidurals, react, everyone has a different epidural experience. But for me, I don't see the point of waiting, honestly, until you're X number of centimeters along and in more and more pain to get it, because in my case, it actually was the best case scenario to get an epidural at 3 centimeters. And I will be doing the same thing again this time if everything works out how I hope it will. So the epidural was literally no big deal at all. As scared as I am of medical things and birth and surgeries and stuff, I happen to not be very afraid of needles. So that really didn't faze me. I honestly was just very excited to get an epidural so I wouldn't be in more pain as I went along, and I was terrified to feel very intense labor contractions. So epidural was no big deal, barely felt it at all. And right away pretty much was numb from my chest down. So I was very lucky to not have felt a single active labor contraction for my entire birth experience. And that's kind of insane to say. I never felt a contraction that was painful enough to take my breath away. I was very, very fortunate actually to get this epidural so early that I was very mildly crampy before I got it, and then that's it. So there was no more pain in my abdomen after that at all. So I feel very, very lucky that that was my experience. I pray that that's my experience this time around. I kind of doubt it, but here's the hoping. Later that night, my OBGYN came back to the hospital and checked me and was planning to break my water, thinking oh, she's going to be 4 or 5, possibly, more dilated. And they checked after all that time. She checks me. I'm a 3.5. So yes, the epidural had stalled my labor, or I just had a very slow labor. And I, at that point, when I had been there for 24 hours and I was only a 3.5, I felt so like defeated, frustrated, just like, am I ever gonna get through this process? It's been so long. Like, a lot of first-time moms deliver in 24 hours. I was like, what is happening? And so I remember she came in, checked me. She said, you're only a 3.5. Like, I really want to wait till you're like 4 centimeters to break your water. So I'll come back tomorrow morning. Immediately after that, I was in tears. I called my mom. I was like complaining to my mom, like, oh my gosh, like I've been here, it feels like forever. And I'm not progressing. And so I guess that would be the one downside of having an epidural, is just it can slow down your labor. It did with mine. But in the long run, it was definitely worth getting an epidural. And the extra, day it took, I would rather have a longer labor than like an extremely excruciating labor. So anyway, at the moment, was very hormonal and frustrated that it had taken so long for me to get, not very far. Immediately, when I hang up with her, my water breaks on its own. Like, that was insane. I remember that was an insane feeling. Like, I had my epidural, but I could still feel like the water. It was insane. So my water breaks on its own around like 9 p.m. And I was like, oh shoot, things are gonna start progressing on their own quickly, because that's what I'd heard. And sure enough, from 9 p.m. till around like midnight, so that's 3 hours, I progressed from a 3.5 to a 10 in 3 hours. Which is nuts. My mom had a very fast labor with me, so I had come in prepared to have possibly a very fast labor, and it had taken a long time for me to get to the active labor stage, but once I was there and my water broke, it took 3 hours for me to be ready to push. So insane. So at midnight, they checked me. I'm a 10, and this is when my biggest fear ever happens. My epidural seems to wear off. And actually, looking back on it, my epidural hadn't worn off. I was still like, it clearly had not worn off, because I still felt no abdominal contractions my entire labor, like active labor contractions. But I started to feel a lot of pressure, which is very normal. Like, it's funny that I expected to feel absolutely nothing when about to push a human out of me, because I'd been told that like the epidural completely numbs you, and it was numbing my pain. But then I started to feel lots going on, obviously, down there, and I was freaking out that my epidural was wearing off, because that was what, a lot of moms said, if you got it early, it would wear off. And I was freaking out mostly that when I pushed the baby out, I'd be able to feel everything, like the tearing, stitching, and everything. Like, I was so scared of that. So I frantically called the nurse back in the room. Actually, I think Garrett went out and got someone. And I was like telling them, my epidural's wearing off. I can't push without an epidural. Like, can you please send the anesthesiologist back in here, or at least like have someone give me more medication so I'm not able to feel like the pushing part of labor. And so a nurse came in and gave me more medication, and I was still feeling like tons of pressure, like an intense amount of pressure, which is so normal. And the anesthesiologist eventually came back in and I guess gave me like, I don't know, some other type of epidural. I think it was like a C-section epidural. So I will not be doing that again. I was fine. I just was freaking out, I think, about the next stage of labor, and I was just terrified I would feel a lot of the pain, and the ring of fire and all that. So I'll go into why I regret getting a second epidural when I didn't really need one, because I was, in fact, very numb to the pain. It was just a lot of pressure that it's a new feeling. So because he had come in and given me this like stronger epidural, or more medication or whatever he did, I really couldn't feel anything down there, and which was, you know, a blessing for the moment, but then later on had ramifications. So this time I will just be getting my one and only epidural and, you know, dealing with the pressure. After all that epidural craziness, like, it kind of delayed my pushing stage. So I started pushing at like maybe 1:30 or 2 a.m. And it took me 4 hours, or like 3 hours and 45 minutes, almost 4 hours, for Bodhi to come to this world. He was born at 6:46 a.m. So it took me from, like 2 a.m. to and we actually had to take a break because my doctor just saw that like I was dead, because I was trying so hard. The problem was that with an epidural, I was so numb, and especially after they gave me the second one, I literally couldn't feel any of the pressure or anything that was happening to my body. So I didn't know, didn't know how to push, didn't know, I couldn't even feel my contractions, you know? So it was very hard to know what to do, because everything was so numb. So I was probably using the wrong muscles, I couldn't even feel anything. So I think that's why it took me a long time. And this was definitely my least favorite part of labor. You know, I'd heard from different videos and articles that the pushing stage was like a mom's favorite time of labor because it was like you could actively do something and it was like progress and like it offered some relief or something. For me, couldn't have been further from the truth. You know, I was lucky to have avoided a lot of the pain because of my epidural. So I could, you know, this was like exhausting, like the craziest ab workout of your life that went on for 4 hours. So yeah, that was like definitely, not looking forward to that again this time. But one thing that was insanely helpful for me was my husband, was a superstar during this part. He was by my side. Because I was completely numb because of, you know, multiple epidurals. My one nurse was on one side of me holding my leg, and then Garrett was on the other side holding my other leg, and he was counting down like my contractions. You know, they obviously during a contraction they have you roll up. I was on my back during like all of labor. They have you like roll up toward your, you know, your chest towards your knees during a contraction so that you can more effectively push the baby out. And, you know, they do that for a count of 3 or 4, whatever it is. And Garrett for 4 hours was like 1, 2, 3, 4, like on his feet, holding my leg back, like cheering me on. Like it was just, you know, it was really, really, really helpful. So by the time this was done, we were both incredibly exhausted. So that was super helpful for me just to have his support. So I feel very blessed in that way. And having, you know, whether it's your husband or partner or your mom or a family member, your sister, someone there during labor is like, I can't even tell you, was so crucial for me. Bodhi came out and everything was fine and he was healthy and he started crying after a few seconds and everything went really, really well. But my OBGYN did have to give me an episiotomy, which I think is getting increasingly rare and these days. But I guess his head was very big for me, no surprise. And I had written it in my birth plan that I didn't want an episiotomy. I was like strongly opposed to that because it just sounds terrifying. And actually, after she gave me an episiotomy or like a partial episiotomy or whatever, I also tore 2 degrees more than that. So I had a 2nd degree tear on top of an episiotomy. And let me tell you, tearing was one of my biggest fears during labor. I was so scared of that. It sounds horrific. Like I'm sure if you know, as a, you know, someone who is pregnant or someone who is planning to get pregnant, like the thought of tearing is just like gives you the freaking chills. But I will say that in my experience, and I had both an episiotomy and I tore, second degree, luckily not more, it was not that bad. It was really not that bad. If you plan to have an epidural, I didn't feel it. I didn't feel it. I will say the episiotomy, I felt a slight pinch, like almost like a paper cut, because you're so numb that it's in the moment when it's happening, you don't really feel it. Let me tell you, there is so much going on. I could feel the baby's head. I could feel Bodhi's head. And so everything out, and that was all so much pressure, and you're feeling so much pressure that I didn't feel the tearing. And recovery was really not that horrible with the tearing. I mean, yeah, are you sore down there? Like, yeah, something major happened. Like, yes, you know, it's not painless. It's uncomfortable. It stings when you try to pee for a few days. Like, I had, you know, stitches, and it's not pleasant, but it's not this horrifically, excruciatingly painful thing. I mean, at least if you plan to get an epidural, it's not as bad as I had feared. So I want to, like, if you're out there watching this, if someone's out there watching this and is like, and that's a big fear of yours, like, you're going to be fine. Like, if I was okay, you're going to be fine. Bodhi was born on Friday, October 28th at 6:46 a.m. And when they put him on my chest, I was in complete shock. We'd been so excited to welcome this baby boy into our family. Like, that's all I could think about for months. But the reality of the situation is so different when there is a real live baby sitting on your chest crying. Like, it is insane. I don't even know how to describe it. You're flooded instantly with, like, shock and love, and, like, the reality of that the fact that you have a child now hits you real hard, like a ton of bricks. It was like the best moment. Garrett took a video of me in that moment, and, like, I wish I could share it to show you the utter shock that I was in the best way, but, like, utter shock. But I, you know, was partially uncovered up top, so I'm not gonna post that. But it was just the most overwhelming, life-changing feeling I've ever had. I was almost in disbelief. Like, it was insane. And I was also just the fact that labor and all of my fears and everything, it was all over. Like, it was over, and now I have this, like, precious baby to care for, like, was just the best feeling in the world. Like I talked about earlier in my video, and I wanted to share this tidbit of information. So the hardest part for me in recovery wasn't the stitches, like, wasn't any of that. My main issue was, even after I could walk, I could not use the restroom by myself. Like, I could not go pee by myself for, like, 2 days. So I was hooked up to a catheter for, like, 2 days, which was the most annoying, icky, like, uncomfortable part of my recovery, because I was just, you know, even after I could walk and was trying to care for my newborn baby that was in the room, like, I was strapped to a catheter and could barely move. So Garrett carried the family for the first few days, because I was pretty much very limited in the amount of in the amount that I could do. So he, you know, was up feeding the baby and changing the baby for the first few days while I recovered, and also just had the catheter in. So that sucked, because I was so numb that it took me a lot longer to be able to have sensation, like normal sensation. So won't be doing that this time. Like, the pressure of the baby when you're at a 10 and it's ready to push, and you're ready to push, is very normal, even with an epidural. I will not be demanding more medicine this time, or like a different type of epidural this time, because yeah, it really hindered me in the recovery process. Bodhi was born with high bilirubin levels, which I think also is really common. We'd actually taken an in-person birth class before he was born that talked about this. So you may want to familiarize yourself with when a baby, like, because a lot of babies are born with high bilirubin levels, and they may or may not need to be under the lights. They wheeled a, like, light box, no idea what the technical name is, into our room, so he didn't need to be taken to the NICU or anything, which was really wonderful. So he was just in our room with us for 24 hours under the lights. And luckily that was enough for his levels to go back down to normal. We were there from Wednesday until Sunday we checked out. So Sunday like afternoon. So 4 days we were spent in the hospital. So we got to go home on October 30th of 2022, which was actually my mom's birthday. Now I'm gonna talk about how I overcame my fear of childbirth. And honestly, a lot of it had to do with just going through it once, unfortunately. Like, it's kind of just something you have to experience to know that it's, in my experience, was not as horrifically bad as I had feared. Is it painless? No. Is it very uncomfortable? Yeah. Is it like pleasant? Not at all. But it's doable, and if I can do it, let me tell you, as someone who had like actually like a debilitating fear of this and so much anxiety surrounding labor, and it was like taking over my thoughts the last few weeks before I delivered, I was absolutely panicked. Like, if I can go through this and like have a baby again 18 months later, you can do it. It was really helpful to look around at all the women that I knew that had already done this. I mean, like throughout history, like most women have children, you know, at least one or two, you know, and a lot of families I knew growing up, and a lot of families I know now have multiple children. So it was very helpful for me to think about, if all of these women can do this, like from the beginning of time, and often have multiple children. You know, my mom grew up next to a family of 17 children in Chicago. If these women can do it, like, I'm made to do this. You are made to do this, you know? So that's a really helpful thought to have in your head. Like, if it was so bad and so traumatizing every single time every woman had a child, why would they do it again and again and again? Another piece of advice I have is I personally stayed away from all of like the raw, real, unmedicated like labor videos on YouTube. Not that there is anything wrong with those, and good for those women for sharing their stories and like, you know, feeling empowered to share their stories, because I think it is actually very important for people to be realistic about labor, so that, and postpartum care, so that moms aren't like totally blindsided. But if you are someone like me who was so terrified and already had all of the worst case scenario thoughts playing in your head constantly, it was not at all helpful to watch like videos of women screaming like they were dying in so much pain, like debilitating pain. Like, that would have been way worse for me. So my advice would just be to, if possible, steer clear of all of the like traumatizing, horrifying, scary accounts of labor, whether it be like videos or podcasts or just stories online of people's like worst case scenarios during labor, because it just, you know, if you're trying to calm your own fears about labor and stay hopeful that your experience is not going to be that horrible, then it's helpful to not consume that kind of content, or at least it was for me, with someone with massive anxiety about it. However, it was really helpful. There are a bunch of YouTubers that have more peaceful labors and things that allow you to be more hopeful about your own experience. And I don't want to take away from the fact that for some women, labor is very traumatizing and painful. And like, you know, there are lots of pain medications that are available. My advice would just be, if you're in there and your epidural is wearing off, or like maybe only working on half of your body or something, like, try your best to advocate to get, you know, the anesthesiologist back in there, or somebody, maybe it needs to be replaced into your back because it's in the wrong area. Just like demand that, you know, stick up for what you need in that moment, because, you know, the anesthesiologist came back in and gave me like way more intense medication that I probably didn't even need. So if you are hurting and something you just feel is not right, advocate for yourself. That would be my advice, because, you know, they can hopefully, you know, fix it. Another thing that I did that really helped me was I created a birth plan. And it wasn't very long. It was only a page, because I didn't want to it to be too much for the nurse. It's too overwhelming. But I did note on it that I had a fear of childbirth and that I was very medically squeamish, and that basically I didn't want to see or hear about or be told anything about my labor that I didn't need to know. Until the baby was put on my chest, I didn't want to see it. I didn't want to know about it. Because it would probably freak me out. So the nurses, and I talked to them about that when I checked in. This calmed my nerves a lot before the birth process started, knowing that I had told the nurses about my fear, so they were just aware. So that was really helpful for me. I also took a few online classes from my local hospital, the hospital I was going to give birth in, which was super helpful because while I wasn't watching all the really scary, horrific birth videos and stuff and listening to all that, I did take a class on C-section recovery so that I would be equipped to handle that if that's where my birth story led. So I was educated on C-sections, what happens, and recovery from that. And also it helped me learn a lot of the medical terminology. Taking these classes helped me learn a lot of the medical terminology they use during labor, that the doctors and nurses use. So in the throes of labor, if they were, if something was going wrong, I'd be able to understand what they were talking about, stuff like forceps or episiotomy, which ended up being very prevalent in my birth story, or vacuum extractions, all of that, what all of that means, so that maybe I had some more control, or at least was aware of what was going on in those moments. And I also, to get me over my fear of labor, I just knew that I needed to get through the actual birth process. I just needed to get the baby out. And then if I was really not okay, if I was still really panicked, that at that point, when the baby's out, they could give me some anti-anxiety medication or Benadryl or something to chill me out, so that I wasn't so panicked. And I ended up not needing that at all. Another thing I want to say is labor goes by in the blink of an eye. It truly does. And in the grand scheme of things, it happens like this. I had a 34-hour labor. A lot of first-time moms, the average length of their labor is shorter than that. Even if you're induced or have a longer labor than I do, it won't go on forever. And it really happens so quickly. I think that's helpful to think about, that, it's not going to go on forever, that you will get through it, and eventually, before you know it, be back home with your precious newborn. So having been through the childbirth process before, this time around, I'm really not anxious at all. It's not pleasant. There's pain involved. There's discomfort involved. But it is nothing near, it's not as bad at all as what I feared. It's doable for sure. And if someone like me with absolutely debilitating anxiety about it can get through it, you 100% can too. And I can't wait for you to go through this experience and have your child put on your chest, because it's truly the most magical, life-changing moment, and it is 100 times worth all the pain of labor. So stay tuned for my next video. I'm going to be talking about postpartum care and all the different products that I used that were super helpful for me after healing from having an episiotomy and tearing, and just my overall postpartum experience. And I hope that will be helpful too. But thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful week.